Hey there, welcome back to the Working Wellbeings podcast. I am joined today by Stacey Ramm. Hey Stacey.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I was chatting just before we logged on today. It was just we don't know each other. It was just a random LinkedIn message that I sent you. So thanks for not just, putting me in the spam folder. I
Oh,
appreciate that.
no, you're absolutely fine. No, thank you ever so much for reaching out.
Yeah, but since then, I've had a look at some of the stuff that you've done and your career and whatnot, and it seems really, really interesting. Which is why I'm excited about this episode, just to find out a little bit more about you and the work that you do, and also your thoughts on the world of well-being. We can put that to rights over the next 45 minutes. So,
Yeah,
do you want to kick off by introducing yourself to the audience?
yeah,
Who
sure.
are
Yeah,
you? What do you do? That sort of thing.
yeah, sure. Hopefully, what I share with you will be as exciting as you've led me up to be.
That'd be amazing. Trust me.
Yeah. Yeah, so Stacey Ramm. So I am currently the Director of Employee Experience for GKN Automotive. My career has spanned across HR well, I've been in HR for most of my career. Aside from, I always say this is a little bit of a fun fact for people. Aside from a couple of years, when I was young and I'd left college and education, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was a flight attendant for a couple of years, which was really cool, and a great fun job when I was young, free and single and didn't have any responsibilities and lived at home. That was fab. And then I moved into HR when I kind of thought about getting a proper job, and started in the world of recruitment. So I originally went into agency side recruitment, recruiting for various businesses in various sectors, and then moved into more internal recruitment, which then led me to working in talent management and talent development. And then I had a really cool opportunity to go and do contracting. So I worked with lots of industries and lots of businesses for about 5, 6 years, in contracting roles, mainly around recruitment, but also looking at talent development, talent management, leadership development programs, programs specifically for underrepresented communities. At that time, it was mostly around gender and ethnicity. Um, so that was really cool. And then I had the opportunity to work for Virgin Media, which I joined them in their recruitment team and then took on a project management role for them, looking at their inclusive hiring programs. So I had that diversity and inclusion lens, and then went on to lead their diversity, inclusion, and wellbeing efforts when they were Virgin Media, but then when they merged with O2 as well. So became double-sized organisation
Yeah.
overnight. So we went from 10,000 colleagues to 18,000 overnight, which was fantastic growth, but also a really interesting time for the business and all of our people that worked there. And then more recently, I joined Every, who people might know as Hermes, the parcel people, sadly not the fashion brand. And I joined them as their first head of diversity and inclusion and wellbeing. So they'd never had anybody looking at that as a standalone position before. So it was quite an interesting dynamic for the business. Obviously, heavily operational organisation. Majority of the colleagues were based out on sites, or in field-based positions, either driving on the road, that sort of thing. So lots of challenges there. And then sadly, my position was made redundant earlier this year, which then left me kind of out of work and looking for other opportunities, which brings me to today. So I've been at GKN Automotive now for 5, 6 weeks. So still very much in my induction and onboarding phase, and learning phase. So my brain is still very much hurting from everything that I'm absorbing, but I'm feeling slightly like a sponge at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, it's difficult as well. I'm assuming you're working a fair bit remotely in the
That's
new role.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it
So
must be quite
GKN is
tricky
a
kind of getting to grips with things when
It
you in
is, yeah.
teams.
I've never had a complete remote induction before. But GKN's a global organisation. So many of my colleagues will be in different countries, on different time zones. So actually working remotely in some aspect is a lot easier, because it allows me to flex my hours and things like that and not have to worry about travel time or getting to certain locations. I mean, we've got offices and sites in the UK, but the majority of our workforce are not actually based in the UK. So lots of time zones and things to consider as well. But yeah, completely remote induction, which has been interesting, and my first one. So yeah, interesting dynamic for
Yeah.
sure.
And useful for you to know about. I mean, if you're responsible now for employee experience, part of that
Yeah,
experience is from induction onwards, right? So
Yeah, of
being able to
course.
empathise with people in that position
Yeah,
and coming into the
absolutely.
business.
Absolutely. It's always good to put yourself in the shoes of people that are going to be having a similar experience, and put yourself into that mindset. I often say, I did this when I worked in recruitment and applied for jobs as a test to see what that user experience looked like.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's always interesting when you come through to a different business and you go through that onboarding journey, right from getting your contract and all of that great stuff, working your notice period usually, then joining. I think it's always interesting to get an idea of that so you can think about, hang on, this is what I might do differently, or this is what I would like to change. Or here's where it was brilliant and we really need to leverage that. So it just gives you a different perspective on things, I think, when you're actually doing it yourself.
Yeah. Did they know you were testing them?
No,
No,
no.
that's
However,
interesting, isn't it?
however, my boss actually, she did say to me, please let us know how your onboarding experience is so that we can learn from it for the future. Because I'm really passionate about creating the best possible onboarding experience for
Mm,
everybody. Because I often think whether you're out of work or you're not, if there's a lull between you getting offered the job and then joining the company, whether that's a matter of weeks or months, that gives people sometimes the time to change their mind or to have doubts or to really think about, to think more greatly and in depth about the job or the company.
mm,
And I think that time is really critical to making sure that that future employee is engaged with the business, and is brought into things really early on, but also has a really smooth transition from one organisation into yours.
mm.
So I would have done that anyway, even if I wasn't asked to give feedback. I think that's just in my nature to think about how things can be done better. I often get told that I'm always in solutions mode, so sometimes maybe I need to dial that down.
No, 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 no. But it's really interesting because we work with a whole range of wellbeing leaders in the past, and we talk about this. What do you call it? Employee life cycle. That's the word.
Yep,
So the employee life cycle from joining right through to leaving or retirement or redundancy, perhaps. So um, every bit of that really matters.
yeah,
I also think what's quite interesting there is like how do you get honest feedback? So I used to work in the survey world back many years ago, employee surveys, well-being surveys, this sort of thing. And one trend that we always saw was that people less than 1 year into a position were immeasurably happy with their job. But I always wondered, are you, or are you just telling us what you want to hear? Because can you imagine if you're like week one and you're like, how happy are you? No, I hate it.
yeah.
There's a certain level of maybe
Well, yeah, but
managing that.
yeah,
I don't
you
know.
would.
Maybe some people would be open and honest, but
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be. Um, I think some people probably would say what the organisation thinks they want them to say or
mm,
what that they want to hear. But I also think that there's a huge amount of data that shows that people who join an organisation tend to leave within their first year. There's a big
right,
increase in that. And often that is when people are joining a company that it's not quite what they thought it was going to be, or maybe they've been overpromised something that actually hasn't come to fruition or isn't reality when they've joined the business. And this is where I think it's really important to be setting someone up for success throughout that interview process by being really honest about the culture, where you're starting from, what you're expecting of them, so that you're not setting them up to fail.
yeah, realistic job previews. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's so true. You talk about well, because this is well-being, right? Because it's
yeah,
the how somebody operates day to day, and that starts from them reading a job advert, job description,
absolutely.
and if that's the expectations that have been set don't match quite. Although I did see one doing the rounds on LinkedIn the other day. You might have seen this. I can't remember what the organization was, but it was a startup organization, and it was like a brutally frank job description. It was like you're going to be asked to work 100 hours a week, and it's going to be horrible, but it will be worth it. We're a startup organization. If you're not up for that, don't apply. And I
Right.
thought, these things you always come back to balance, don't you? That you're like, there's realistic job previews, and there's also like just
Then they're scaring
advertising a
people away.
lethal role.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've not seen that to be honest, but yeah, I think there is being realistic and then there's perhaps being a bit unreasonable maybe in what you're asking, and maybe putting a sticking plaster over it by justifying the fact that you're a startup. That doesn't mean to say that you can ask for every hour
Mm.
under the sun from your employees. That's not
Yeah.
really how the deal works, is it?
Yeah. And then just being like, yeah, we told you. We told, oh,
Yeah,
you've had a mental breakdown. We did tell you it was going to be
yeah.
hard.
This is what we set you up for.
Yeah, ridiculous. But that's
Yeah.
really interesting, that whole employee life cycle piece. And another question, I got loads of questions just from the stuff you said in the intro, including I want to know more about your the flight attendant stuff, but we'll leave that maybe. That's the entire
I
the
knew you was
end.
going to ask that. Everyone always wants to know more about
I don't know,
that.
it's cool, isn't it? I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll leave that for now. Maybe I'll forget about it as time goes on. But your titles are really interesting that you've had. So obviously you said you had diversity, inclusion, and well-being as a
Yeah.
title for a couple of organisations. You mentioned your current title is employee experience.
Yeah.
Um, what does that mean? Are they different? Do they end up being the same thing, just called something slightly different? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always one for job titles can be really misleading because I think it depends on the organisation that you work for, whether it's a UK-based organisation or a global organisation. I think job titles can vastly differ. I also don't think that it always accurately represents the job that you do day to day for 37 hours a week or however many hours a week you work. Um, Employee experience at GKN. So my role actually is similar to the job that I did at Every previously. So my job at Every was head of diversity, equity, inclusion, and wellbeing. However, because it was such a lean people function, I really was fortunate to get involved in so much more than that. So I was involved in engagement and some level of communications. Um, I was also involved in employer brand and EVP. And actually that all of those skills that I gained in that position have transferred into the position that I'm doing now. So employee experience for me is about creating the best possible experience for every employee that works for that brand, whether they're a new employee coming into the business from another organisation or from an external, whether that's returning to work, whatever that looks like, or whether that's like employees that are progressing within the organisation and moving, whether that's through promotion or moving throughout the business into different opportunities. My position really encompasses all parts of that employee life cycle to be able to create the best possible experience for every employee under that. Now at GKN, we've got 25,000 employees, so that's quite a task to make everyone happy. But you want to be able to create the best possible experience, and all of those touch points around diversity and inclusion, around well-being, engagement, that all touches onto things like onboarding or policies or what we're setting our people up for in terms of success. Are we being realistic in terms of, I guess, what our people deal is, in our brand and our EVP? So all of those things, I guess, kind of under my umbrella. So my role here is slightly broader than what I've had before. But I think it really gives me the opportunity I'm quite a hands-on person. And so whilst I still have that strategic thinking, I'm quite a technical and hands-on person, so I like to be able to support the teams to get the jobs done and be involved in the things that matter and that are going to have the biggest impact whilst being practical solutions for our people.
Do you know, it's really interesting because that's the second. It's a similar thing. I recorded a podcast last week actually, so I guess these episodes will be coming out
Right.
at a similar kind of time with a lady called Jo. So she's I'm going to get this wrong now, but head of well-being and people at Card Factory.
Right.
And she talked about the breadth of her role as well. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was that, because I'm always thinking, where does well-being, this question comes up a lot, where does well-being sit? And the honest answer is it sits everywhere.
Right.
It's comms, it's induction, it's
Yeah.
pay, it's like,
Yeah.
it sits everywhere. So pigeonholing that to a single, this is a well-being leader who sits in this one room and looks after well-being specifically. You wonder whether that does hold that role down a little bit, and maybe having a slightly broader remit, as you've described there, has the benefits to it. I guess the downside is because these roles are still, even though they've been around for a couple of decades, they're still in their relative infancy.
Yeah.
That could lead to a little confusion, I guess, because
Yeah.
someone within your business might look at your job role and be like, employee experience, what's that? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I
They know
actually
who
had
the
somebody
IT
ask that.
director is, but they don't know who like employee experience is or what they
Yeah.
do.
I actually had that somebody asked me that earlier today actually, what my job actually means, what does employee experience actually mean? And I do think that that's a really common question because people see these, I don't want to say fancy job titles, but they see this term that they might not be familiar with. Whereas if you said inclusion or if you said well-being, that's a term that people can understand more. Employee experience is obviously a broader term that encompasses so much more, but a bit like like you've just said, Matt, I think that for me, I see it as a really positive thing because it helps me to not operate in a silo. Whereas in some businesses that I've worked in previously, where it's just been inclusion or just being well-being, you often find that you're just operating in that sphere and you're not really thinking about how that connects with other elements of the employee life cycles. Whereas in this role, because I look after the entire thing, or many parts of that, I know that what's going to cross into, what I'm working on in one space will cross into another naturally and organically, and that's the way that it should be. Lots of people ask where well-being should sit, and I think that it's often up for debate in the businesses that you're working, and I think that does depend on how well-being is viewed. Is it viewed as a physical well-being, or is it viewed as mental well-being and social well-being and all of that stuff? I think it depends on where the organisation is in their maturity level as to how well-being is viewed. Mm-hmm. There's lots of organisations that would put well-being in health and safety, and there'll be other organisations that view well-being as a added value employee initiative and benefit. And that's, I think at GKN we're a little bit in the middle of that in some ways. And I think it's about how we transfer that into more of a people proposition and a benefit for our employees, as opposed to just being about physical safety and physical well-being for people in the business. And there's lots of organisations that are in that transitioning phase at the moment. So it's always up for debate, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the answer probably doesn't really matter.
as long as the job gets done, that's it. It doesn't matter. Gets done,
as long as day to day someone feels like their role is being improved and is impacted positively on their life and has a meaning associated with it. Yeah, but it is interesting. It is interesting, kind of where it's at. You mentioned the health and safety link there, so I should have done a little bit more homework here. But do you do a lot around physical health and safety? Is it the type of business that has, for example, manufacturing aspects to it and whatnot?
Yeah, so GKN has, majority of our workforce are in production and manufacturing environments.
Yeah.
So because we produce parts that go into cars, ultimately, our production environment obviously has lots of physical health and safety elements that they have to consider because they're in plants and in operational environments, so they have to protect the health and the safety and the physical well-being of our people from a duty of care and responsibility perspective. That was a similar consideration when I worked at Every previously, again because it was an operational workplace environment where lots of people were in shop floors and that type of manufacturing or production type environment. So I think when you are in an organisation like that, sometimes the line gets a little bit blurred between the what I would see as an added value well-being versus duty of care and responsibility from a safety perspective of people, and that's always a kind of difficult line, I think.
Although do you find, I'm a bit biased here because I've done some work in those sorts of industries, and do you find, this is a loaded question because I want you to say yes, do you find them more receptive to perhaps, so the conversation around, for example, psychosocial risk, that not the things that could cause harm in the workplace aren't just that piece of machinery or that car or that forklift truck. It's actually your manager or your workload level and these sorts of things. Do you feel that perhaps because they're well versed when it comes to physical health and safety, more receptive to those messages around psychosocial risk, or do you feel like it's still a bit of a jump for people?
I think, to be honest, it really depends on the leadership team of those locations. I think I've been really fortunate so far to see that there is real support and advocacy for well-being from beyond just that risk perspective. within GKN, we've got obviously within the EU, psychosocial risk and risk assessments are coming as part of EU legislation. So there is a huge amount of buy-in, I would say, across the business to be more forward-thinking within the wellbeing space to support employees beyond that physical risk and safety perspective. So yes, in a nutshell, I would say yes. But I always think that there's a caveat to that it really depends on where that location is in their journey. You know, if you went out into some countries and regions, they might be not as well versed in that as European countries, I would say, and that is largely just because of the legislation and conversations that have happened within the EU around psychosocial risk and physical well-being and safety. I think also there's a big talk about oh, I've lost my train of thought. There's a big talk about. I'll come back to it. I've forgotten what I was. I've forgotten my train of thought.
Yeah.
But there's lots of elements of psychosocial risk that links into, much broader topics around well-being. Like you said, obviously, it's not just about safety. It's about workload. It's about resource. It's about time management. It's about how managers treat their employees. So there's much more elements of consideration, which then I think gives people the tools and resources to think beyond just a physical element of safety.
Yeah. I just find it all I find it fascinating. I think the thing that really captured my imagination when I first came across this was, and I might be wrong here, this might be really stereotypical of me, but it seems like a bit of a, maybe I shouldn't put this on recording, I'm going to say it anyway. It seems like a bit of a paradox to me that, the world of well-being, if we're being honest, originally seems to have come from like the soft and fluffy bit, right? It's from HR and it's the people services and it's all that side of benefits, all that sort of thing. And at some point, we've had the realization finally that no, it's more important than that. It's about risk and it's about people's health in the workplace, for example. Organizations and individual teams and individuals within those teams who worked, in construction or manufacturing or all those sorts of things, they, to me, in my head, and again, this is where the stereotype comes in, they're the people who I see might have been least attracted to the piece around the soft and fluffy well-being, thinking, oh, well, that's just going to, let me do my job. But they may be most receptive to the piece around what well-being actually is, which is more related to that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no.
So it's kind of flipped on its head a little bit. And like I said, that's oversimplifying far too much. But I just find that fascinating. That there's organizations that 10, 15 years ago I would have come to with, let's do this to improve well-being, and then they've been like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? But now, because they see the link between that and health and safety and the new ISO standard and things like this, they're the ones who are asking for it. And actually, I hope that they're the organizations who could take this to the next level. Because,
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remember recruiting for manufacturing and engineering businesses a lot, like at the very start of my sort of recruitment career, really. And if I'd have talked to them about well-being at that time, they would have assumed that I was being very soft and fluffy and coming up with a HR initiative. And they very much felt at that time that something was being done to them, not that they saw the benefit of doing that to prevent risk happening. I don't think, for a long time, I don't think there's been a direct correlation between the fluffy side of well-being, if we want to call it that, to the physical side of well-being and protecting employee well-being and safety. And this is where I think at GKN, the two being connected is actually a benefit, because there are so many of our regions and sites that are really bought into well-being in a much broader sense of the word, because of the risk and because of the legislation. And there's also lots of our regions and locations that are thinking about psychological safety and how that connects into well-being, and obviously that plays into inclusion and belonging and all of that stuff as well. So I do think, historically people would look at a manufacturing environment and think, oh gosh, don't talk to me about well-being because that's another HR initiative that I haven't got the time for because I'm a busy people manager and I've got a plant to run and operate in. There'll probably still be some of that in most operational and manufacturing environments. But I think the fact that there is legislation and new ISO standards coming into place, I think that only helps it. But I do think that there are so many advocates in this business and in other businesses that I've worked in, to change the conversation about well-being, and it being much broader than that physical well-being piece, and going into the social well-being, financial well-being, you know, and thinking about it from more sort of a mental well-being, and doing more to support their employees as well. I think that can only be a good thing. And, you know, I think the more that we connect the two between that health and safety and the fluffy well-being, I think the better it will be for organisations to really drive change in that space to better support and protect the well-being of their people.
Absolutely. Yeah. I really wish Amy Edmondson hadn't called it psychological safety. It confuses people, doesn't it? What's the difference between psychological safety and then psychosocial risk and psychological health and safety, which is different, you know?
Yeah. There's lots of these terms around there, and psychological safety, I think over the last couple of years has become a little bit of a buzzword, and I think people throw it around and they don't know the true meaning of it. But I think, you know, I think it's always up for debate. But I think ultimately, as you touched on at the beginning, as long as the work gets done, it really doesn't matter what you call it or how you frame it. As long as the conversation is happening and the wellbeing support is there for you and your people, I think that's ultimately what matters in driving that change in a business.
I could talk to you all day about psychological health and safety and psychosocial risk of that type of
yeah,
thing.
lots of terms. It's lots of mouthfuls.
Yeah, I won't do that. Let's move away from ISO standards for a little bit. So, one of the things that I was going to ask you about that you kindly said you'd be willing to answer some questions about was you had a bit of a gap. You mentioned you were made redundant from that was from Every, right?
Yeah, that is.
So, and then before you joined this, what was the period when you were between roles?
Yeah, so I was out of work for 5 months or so. So I was made redundant from Every at the beginning of the year. It was around about 2 or 3 weeks after we returned from Christmas. So it was a little bit out of the blue, and obviously not the best timing, not that redundancy ever is, right? And for me, it was the first time that I'd ever been made redundant. So it was a little bit of a unknown territory, I think. And I've never been out of work. So it was really unusual for me. I've only ever really had a couple of weeks gaps in between jobs, and that was an intentional gap, as opposed to, being made redundant and that kind of being forced upon me. And I think for me, my experience of redundancy wasn't the best, to be completely frank. And that was more just in terms of my experience of being made redundant in the organisation that I was in. It wasn't the best from an employee experience perspective at that kind of final touch point within a business, I think. And I think that I didn't really know what to expect because I'd not been in that position before, but I had quite a quick turnaround from being notified that my position was being made redundant to then leaving the business was a really short window of time, I felt. And I've handled lots of redundancies and been on the other end of it, but never been on the receiving end of it, I suppose. So I had, from that point, I had about 5 months out of work and looking for other opportunities. It was quite a turbulent time, I would say. And I think that largely is because the market at the moment for jobs and for people out of work is so different to anything that I've ever seen before. And that goes back to my days in recruitment.
How do you mean?
Yeah, in the sense that there's so many great people that are looking for work at the moment. So many people that have got the open to work banners on LinkedIn, and so many people applying for jobs. Like I've got lots of people that still work in talent and recruitment within my network. And I remember seeing something on LinkedIn within the last couple of weeks that shared that somebody had received 900 applications for a job, one job. And I couldn't imagine being that recruiter that then has to sift through those applications and remove potentially good people from a shortlist just because they need to narrow down that shortlist to make it more manageable. And I think the market is quite volatile at the moment as well. So for me, I was interviewing right from the start of being made redundant with organisations. And naively, I just thought that I would find another job quite quickly and I would start another job and, be on my merry way, so to speak. And I got to the point of being offered twice before getting to the point that I was offered the GKN role and other positions. And, you know, for various reasons, they were pulled. And that was either budget or not having the correct authorization to recruit the role or things like that. And I think it then just plays with your emotions a little bit.
And were these wellbeing specific roles?
Yeah, well, one of them was employee experience and one of them was inclusion and wellbeing. Yes. So yeah, I think, you know, it's really difficult as well when you're wanting to join a business in the employee experience space to make an improvement, and then you get to the point of offer within that respective organisation and it doesn't kind of come off for whatever reason. I think it can then, you know, play with your emotions. So it was a very turbulent time for me personally, I would say. But yes, that was my first experience of being made redundant. So it was difficult to compare that to anything else, I think.
Yeah. And having kind of lived through it and, you know, in your new role now, what, in hindsight, do you feel helped you during that period, or is there anything you'd have done differently? You know, I'm thinking there are people maybe listening to this who are in a similar position, right? Between roles, applying for different roles, and is there, I guess what I'm asking is there any advice that you'd offer?
I mean, I could talk about this all day, but I won't. I think for me, I think a lot of people say, oh, you should try and stick to a routine in terms of logging on your laptop and applying for jobs in the same way that you would have logged on and worked. And that worked for me for a period of time. It didn't work for me for the whole 5 months. And I think if I'd have tried to do that for the whole time, I would have snapped much sooner, I think. And I probably could have really impacted my own mental health and well-being. I think the biggest bit of advice that I was given, and I would continue to give this to other people, is to take time for you during that window of searching for a job, whether that's a few weeks, whether it's a month, you know, whether it's multiple months. Take time out for you and make sure you look after your own well-being, particularly if you're in this space of being a people practitioner. We often give advice to other people to look, you know, to make sure they're considering their well-being and their team's well-being. You have to take that own advice yourself, which is also really difficult to do, right? Because you're so used to giving it and not necessarily receiving it. I think for me particularly, I made sure that I spent time with friends and family. I've got 2 dogs, so I was, you know, I was guilt tripped with the puppy dog eyes to making sure that I regularly still got out of the house and took them out on walks. And I was also really fortunate to have a holiday in that time. So I purposely took about a month out of my job search. And I always intended on doing that anyway. But I had a holiday that I'd booked like last year. And I felt really guilty about still continuing to take the holiday. But until I was on the holiday, I didn't realise how much I actually needed it. And it just gave me a really good opportunity. I mean, I had a couple of interviews whilst I was away, but it gave me, other than that, a good opportunity to completely switch off and forget about looking for a job. And when I came back, I felt re-energised and I guess more productive in my search. And I felt that I was able to give more to my interviews, because interviewing all day, every day is really stressful. And if you're anything like me, I really overthink. So I'd come away from the interview and think, oh, I should have said that, or why didn't I talk about that? And I'd beat myself up over it. And I think just having that time out allowed me to come back and give it my all, really, which I do think helped me in being, you know, reaching a successful outcome.
It's really great advice. It can become all consuming, I'm guessing, at points. And it's almost decompressing. I've got a funny story. Hopefully it's about my dad. Hopefully he doesn't listen to this podcast, probably. I'll try and keep it quick. So he's an engineer in the nuclear industry, and he worked, he was company man, right? You know, so from like, you know, sweeping up in as a 18-year-old right through to, you know, a management position. He worked for, if not the same organization, it was in the same industry, you know, suit and tie, 9 to 5 every day, you know, like it was that sort of job. And then when I was younger, I can't remember how old I was. I must have been in my teens, perhaps. He was made redundant for the first proper time in his career. And hilariously, and this is a bit, he'll hate me for sharing, he basically, from memory, it must have been about 3 months that he was off. And for those 3 months, he grew his hair, he grew a massive beard, and he basically did jigsaws for
Right.
3 months. It was almost like his brain went, I've done the kind of corporate life for 30 years, however long it was, and it just switched. The funnier thing was that he then got a job. So he interviewed, he got a job back doing a similar thing, suit and
Yeah.
tie. And genuinely, one morning I came down, and I'm thinking, where is he doing his jigsaw? He just came down, suit and shirt, shaved completely, had a haircut, and he was like, right, I'm back to work. And it was like, you
Just that mode had
psychologically,
switched.
yeah, like psychologically you were that, and then you completely changed it. But I'm making light of it with that story there. But there is something about decompressing, right? Because you can
Yeah,
put too much pressure on yourself to get straight back into it,
you
and it
can.
starts to snowball and all that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So
And I think, like you said, it does become all consuming. And it's really difficult when, if you don't have supportive people around you, it can also be quite difficult. And this is where I think your network really comes into play here. And as people practitioners, we often encourage, people to network. And I think, again, we need to take our own advice whilst looking for work. But if you don't have a supportive network in your personal life, it can be really pressurized and then, become even more consuming, particularly if you've got a deadline that you need to get a job by, or maybe you've got friends or family that are saying, oh, just apply for any job, or, do this job, or just go work at Tesco, or, whatever that might be. I think it also then devalues how we think about our job. Like for me, I had a couple of friends that said to me, oh, just why don't you just apply for any job? And I was adamant that that's not what I was going to do. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And it wasn't a pride thing. It was, for me, I wanted to take the time and use my energy in a field that I'm really passionate about to leverage getting a position in this space, rather than just taking any job. And for me, that was largely because I didn't want to have to go into a space where I didn't know anything about that, learn and train, and then ultimately 6 months down the line say, oh, I found a job doing what I actually love and I'm going to leave. And I didn't want to leave that other organisation in a difficult position trying to then fill my role again. So I wanted to spend my energy and time finding a job doing what I love. And that was met with many difficult conversations, I think, and lots of back and forth with friends and some family. But I'm glad that I stuck to my guns about that. I'm glad that I stuck to, the right thing for me, despite what other people said that I should have done. It was definitely the right thing for me to continue doing. And I think if I'd have not wasted time, but if I'd have used time applying for any job, I wouldn't have had as much energy to put into finding a job in this space that I really care about.
yeah, it's really good advice, and and it'll be different for everyone, right? It'll be a
Yeah.
different experience for everybody, but yeah, I really appreciate you answering some questions around that as well, because
No, no problem.
it's an interesting one. As I said earlier, whilst this industry is still in its relative infancy, there is going to be a little more fluctuation, turmoil around some of these roles.
Yeah.
It's not quite as straightforward. Because interestingly, some of these roles disappear as well. It's not finance director roles don't just disappear. An organization doesn't just say, well, we need a finance director anymore.
We don't
But
need anyone to look after our money anymore. We'll just manage it
yeah, we'll
ourselves.
just be all right. But when it comes to well-being, inclusion, those sorts of things, there's more of a risk of
Well,
that
they're just seen
happening.
as a nice to have, I think, sometimes, and
Yeah.
not an essential role in the business. And I think that a lot of that is down to where the organisation is in their maturity
Mm.
around these topics and conversations, as to how they view that and how valuable they view that in the business.
Yeah, you talked about maturity. I was going to ask a question about that because I think that's really interesting. How do you measure maturity within a business?
I think that, again, I think that is, you could ask 10 different people that and get 10 different answers.
Yeah.
My view is, so my way of doing that is I like to spend a lot of time in the business and have lots of conversations with various people in various parts of the organisation to understand their thinking and their level of conversation and comfortableness with this level of conversation around topics like inclusion and well-being. And I think that is largely just because I prefer the people first approach, like a people-centered approach. there are many maturity tools out there that you can use to assess inclusion maturity, to assess wellbeing maturity. For me, it's about how comfortable people are in having that conversation, where they're up to in terms of, I guess, their offering for their people around wellbeing, or what their inclusion efforts look like to that point, and actually what their ambitions are for the future. So if they've got really reasonable, realistic expectations about the future of wellbeing or inclusion within their organisation, I actually think that says a lot about somebody, because they already realise where they're at and where they're starting from, and it says a lot about their organisation and that point. I think if somebody or an organisation comes out with unrealistic expectations that are so far out of reach from where they're at currently, I think it says a lot about their maturity and their level of understanding of how to get there. And finally, I think it's about what they're aiming to get from it. If they're unclear on why they're doing this or why it matters, I think that also says a lot about organisational maturity levels.
Yeah, God, that's a good answer. I'll put that one up. That was good. That was good.
I'm sure you will have lots of other people tell you something different. My approach is just that I use a people-centered approach, because that's what works for me.
Yeah, I really like that. You didn't use this exact phrase, but like, it's self-awareness,
Yeah.
the level of self-awareness that a business has about how easy this stuff is, and the journey.
And I think also lots of organisations, often I've worked in many organisations that tend to look over the fence too much at what the next door organisation is doing.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And that self-awareness that you just said there, for me, is so important. And that's why I do the job that I do. And that's why, frankly, I accepted the job at GKN, because they are very self-aware as an organisation.
Okay.
And that's what mattered to me. I didn't want to work for an organisation that was constantly looking over the fence at what their neighbour was doing, because that doesn't matter to your business or your people, and that's what you've got to keep remembering.
Yeah. Do you know what? I love that. I'm a big data geek, right? So background in surveys and all the rest of it. And for years, and I still stand by this. Here's my controversial thing, but I think benchmarking's overrated. I genuinely look, I think it's got a place, and it helps you to put some of your results in context and blah 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 blah. But what it leads to is, what are they doing over there, and how do we do that? And it's like, that's not the same business as you. And then what they'll come back and say is, well, can we create a benchmark that's really comparable businesses? And again, it's like, well, you can make them more comparable, but it's still not your business.
Yeah.
It's not
your culture isn't the same. The people that you've got are not the same. And I will caveat by saying that benchmarking certainly plays a role when it comes to data, for particularly around inclusion and some things like that, because there's just not enough data to go around. So it's always useful to benchmark. Mm-hmm. However, the caveat always has to be that the organisation that you're looking at is not the same organisation that you've got. The people that work there are not the same people that work here. Yes. The culture that you've got there is not the same culture that we've got here, or the level of maturity is not going to be the same. So it's never a direct comparison. You can draw some conclusions from it, and I think around inclusion data specifically, it's really worthwhile looking at the labour market as a whole, not necessarily one specific company. So it does play a part, but I think there's always got to be that caveat that it's never going to be a direct comparison or give you a real clear view of where they're starting from versus where you are.
Yeah. No, don't get me wrong. I'd love to throw it out completely, but I agree. It does have its place. However, I would always take, as I sometimes use it, I sometimes see it as used as an excuse to not take a long-term view on this stuff as well. But I would take a long-term set of data within your own organisation as a much stronger indicator of where you're moving and what's going well and what's not going well, rather than a one-off, how are we doing compared to that other business over there.
I think you're right. But I think that largely depends on how much data you have in your organisation.
True.
Because every organisation, I've worked in some organisations that have an abundance of people-related data, which is fantastic, because you can, compare and do lots of analysis around that. I've also worked in other organisations that have very little people data. And so then they have to use external benchmarking to start from somewhere, because when you're designing a wellbeing strategy or an inclusion strategy, it has to be data led. So if you haven't got the data internally, you need to use some source of truth, and that might be labour market data, or it might be external competitor data. So you have to start somewhere. Otherwise, you could just be putting a finger in the wind and guessing, and then that's not going to help anybody either. So you have to take a stand. But this is where I think that if you are using external data, your strategy shouldn't be a 5-year strategy. It should be a shorter term, so that then in a year's time you can reevaluate where you are internally in terms of your people data and what your survey results are telling you, and then reassess and redesign.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, just my view, and that could be controversial.
No, that's that. I love it. That's what podcasts are for, right?
Yeah.
No one will listen to it anyway. So.
Well, let's hope so.
No, I hope people do. Because I think it's a really important point you made there, and I love that. And that's probably another subject. I have so many of these conversations, and I'm like, we need more. We need more episodes, because that's probably that whole piece that you've just been discussing there around data and informing your strategy. That's a whole conversation on its own, right? Which I'd love to have at some point. But the time has absolutely flown, and I don't want to take up too much of your time today. So I just finish up by, asking, I guess, was there anything that you were hoping that I'd ask you today that I've not? I guess it's been a little bit.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think it's been a good conversation. I think we've covered off, quite a lot. I think I could talk about these subjects for hours, and I certainly agree that when you're delving into something like data or well-being trends or other things, there's huge amounts of things that you can talk about. But yeah, I think we've had a really good conversation, so hopefully it'll be of benefit to the listeners.
Yeah, sounds good. I never asked you about the cabin crew.
Oh yeah,
well, that.
Maybe that should be episode 2.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how relatable that would be to other people practitioners, but we all start somewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that's really interesting. That's something that's come up for all this. Just the diverse set of backgrounds that people have come from and experienced. And I think that's good. I think that's really.
It always gives you some level of skills. I mean, I developed my customer and people skills in that very first job, for sure.
I just recently been on holiday, and I can imagine. Yeah.
I definitely have a different level of appreciation to maybe other people on flights, for the flight attendants, for sure, after doing that job for 2 years and knowing it's not anywhere near as glamorous as what people think it is.
So what you're telling me is, when you do your job now in the office, and so someone you don't like, you could just go and smash their knee with a trolley.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, not quite, unfortunately. Well, I say unfortunately, but no, not quite. It doesn't quite work like that, but definitely gave me some patience and customer skills, let's say.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, look, we'll call it there. Thank you so much for chatting to me today. If people want to find you or message you, you might not want people to message you, but where's best? Where's best?
Yeah, LinkedIn is always best. So Stacey Ramm on LinkedIn. As I say, Employee Experience Director at GKN Automotive. But more than happy to have messages from people that are listening, and have further conversations. I'm part of lots of D&I and wellbeing networks, so if anybody that's listening is part of that, would always love to connect and network with people, for sure.
Good. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Really great conversation. Speak soon.